Hey guys, welcome, or welcome back. Either way, thanks for joining me. In this video, I'm going to show you my slab flattening jig. Now, I discovered extruded aluminum recently, and man, this stuff is amazing. I really do love it. You can build almost anything out of it. I've seen some pretty crazy setups with this stuff. And recently, I had a customer request a pretty large round table. So large, in fact, that I had to get 8-foot lengths of this stuff just to be able to accommodate it. Now, most slab flattening jigs don't need to be this big. It all depends on your setup and what type of furniture you make, etc. I decided to go overkill. I didn't want to make it too small and then have to make it larger again later or have a second one made, so I just went big and that's it. Now, I will warn you, this is not for the budget friendly in mind. This did cost me quite a penny, and it was a difficult investment at first, but once I have it, now I have it, and I don't have to buy it again later. Now, for those that are interested, I will disclose what I spent on this. That way you can have an idea of how much this would cost you if you were to go with this kind of setup. And again, this can be customized so many different ways. There's so many different options. The leveling feet I use, you don't necessarily have to use, etc., etc. There's a million and one ways you can build these things. But I'm going to show you the way I built mine. So assuming you're still watching, as you can see, I'm assembling the base here and the rails. Now the rails are made of 4080. Let me take a step back. All of this is Series 40 extruded aluminum. That single piece there on the bottom is 4040. Now the 40 stands for millimeters. They make this in different sizes, 2020, 4040. I don't know if they make it 8080. I'd have to check that, but it gets pretty beefy once you get up to that 80 millimeter size. If you noticed, I was attaching feet underneath those horizontal members, and these are them. They're just M8 threaded leveling feet that you can get off of Amazon. Now, if you're wondering what those feet are threading into, these are them. These are just spring nuts. Again, M8, you can just get them off of Amazon in bulk. Pretty cheap. So those horizontal members are 4040, as you can see, 40 millimeters square, both sides. Now the crane rails, as I call them, I use crane terminology. It's my background, mechanical engineering, but I use 80-40. I don't want any deflection when it's traveling along the length, because any deflection that you have in that crane rails section, it's going to transfer into your slab, and it's going to create a dip. The other way to create a dip would be in the trolley deflection, and I use 80-40 for that as well. I'll get to that in a little bit. But in the meantime, you can just see I'm attaching everything using these angled brackets. And these are nothing fancy. You can buy these off of Amazon. They're pretty cheap. They come in a pack of 20, I think. Like everything in all my other videos, I'll link everything in the description below. That way you know exactly what I'm using. At this point, I'm just assembling the other side. I'm really taking my time to make sure everything is plumb, square, and true. Because of the size of this jig, it's really prone to racking. If this jig were a little smaller, I wouldn't have this issue as much, but I just got to make sure to get the dimensions perfectly right. Moving on now, these are linear bearings, and I use 2 each for the crane rails and 2 each for the trolley rails. I'm calling trolley. The trolley is what the router actually attaches to, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But I made up these blocks to connect the 2 linear bearings together, and this gives me a good distance between the trolley rails to attach my router. Now the way these linear bearings work is they have hard plastic pads both on the sides and on the top. Now this is a double width linear bearing. They make these in singles. They also make them in different configurations with the mounting positions of the holes and slots and everything, so you can go pretty wild and crazy. There's other ways to attach the router to this jig. I've seen rollerblade wheels and skateboard wheels, etc. So it gets pretty creative. There's many ways of doing this, so you don't really have to have this setup that I have. This is just what I went with. Now, I do plan to upgrade and automate this a little bit better in the future. That wooden piece that connects the 2 linear bearings together, I actually plan to replace that with an aluminum plate that I'm going to drill holes in and then thread the holes on the linear bearings themselves. This way I don't have to use the screws and the nuts and mess around with it every time. So now that I have this assembled, it's time to put these on the crane rails. Now, you can just ignore some of those missing nuts there. This is just for demonstrative purposes. Normally I would have nuts on all of those. I lost a couple of them in the process here. So just slide them on the rail through the V-slots. You got to line it up just a little bit in the beginning, but once it's on, you can see it slides pretty easily and glides very nicely. And the good thing about these linear bearings is those pads are replaceable, and they're not too expensive either. So moving on, I'm going to level this now by adjusting all those feet and shimming up any sides that are pretty low. My floor is very out of flat, I'll call it. The back side where I am now is almost 1.5 inches lower than the front side. So now I'm just leveling the jig at this point because I do plan to pour epoxy very shortly. Now, if you're just flattening a slab of wood, you don't need it level, you just need it flat. So as long as those members are flat across, you should be fine. Now it's time to attach the trolley rails, as I call them. These are also 40/80, just like the crane rails. Again, this was what I was talking about earlier with the deflection and the trolley rails. You don't want this thing bending as you're sliding across it with the router. Now to attach these, it's a little tricky. This was the initial setup I went with. I've recently changed it to studs, but I'll show you what I'm using here. These are M8 slide-in T-nuts, and they just go right in the V grooves of the rails themselves. Use another M8 screw, and then you can fasten down whatever you need to. Now, like I mentioned, these are kind of a pain. You have to blindly reach underneath and slide them into position before attaching them. I didn't show it, but you'll understand if you go with this setup. So these are the other linear bearings, and this is what the router actually sits on when it slides across the slab. Now if you look closely here, you can see my demonstration of the motion where it racks a little bit and gets bound. You definitely have to make some little adjustments once you get it set up initially. So here's the router plate that my router attaches to. It's nothing fancy, just some 3/4 scrap I had laying around. Drilled some holes and just screw it down. That's pretty much it. I do plan to attach some aluminum plate to this in the future to upgrade with some quick release mechanisms. It is a little annoying to have to thread in these screws every single time I want to use it. Now, once you attach your router, you're pretty much good to go at this point. So for viewer viewing pleasure and to keep you thoroughly entertained, here's some footage of me actually using it. Now, it's kind of boring. If you don't want to watch, I understand. If you do want to watch, great, I appreciate it. Before you go though, if you wouldn't mind hitting the subscribe or the like button, I would greatly appreciate that as well. Feedback is very important, and making videos like this is a little tricky in a vacuum and not hearing back on what's working and what's not working. So any feedback is very valued. So thanks again in advance, and take care.